What does it mean to inherit nothing but scorn? To be told in front of the whole world that you are worth less than the dust on your own father's land? For 20-year-old Elias Vance, this wasn't a question. It was the brutal, sun-baked reality of a Georgia afternoon in 1880. The air on the porch of the Vance estate was heavy, thick with the sweet, cloying scent of magnolias that couldn't quite mask the bitter smell of grief and judgment. His father, Jedediah Vance, a man carved from oak and granite, was in the ground, and the community had gathered like vultures to witness the division of his kingdom. They were here to see a king's legacy passed down, but they were about to witness a son's public execution. The Vance estate was a testament to power, a sprawling canvas of cotton fields and pastures that stretched to the hazy blue horizon. The main house stood proud and white, its columns like the bones of a giant, a symbol of a family that had tamed the land through force and will. But for Elias, it had never been a home. It was a cage, a place where his quiet nature was seen as a flaw, and his gentle hands, more suited to mending a split fence than breaking a wild stallion, were a source of his father's unending disappointment. He stood apart from the mourners now, a gaunt, wiry figure swallowed by a borrowed suit, his eyes holding a storm that no one bothered to look close enough to see. His older brother, Caleb, was the very man their father had always wanted. Broad-shouldered, with a confident, cruel smirk permanently etched on his face, he was the center of the crowd's attention. He accepted condolences with a practiced gravity, but his eyes were alight with the fire of imminent ownership. He was the sun, and Elias was the shadow, a pale, silent figure clinging to the edges of the light. The family lawyer, a man with a face like worn leather and eyes that offered no comfort, finally cleared his throat. The rustle of the will being unfolded was the only sound, a dry, brittle whisper that seemed to suck the very moisture from the air. The words began to fall like hammer blows, each one building the foundation of Caleb's new world and demolishing Elias's. The land, all of it, every last acre of rich, dark soil that Elias knew better than the back of his own hand, was bequeathed to Caleb. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound of pity mixed with a grim satisfaction. This was the natural order of things after all. The strong son inherits. The weak one is forgotten. The house, the livestock, the assets, the name itself, all of it, a river of inheritance flowing directly to the favored son. Elias stood perfectly still, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. He felt the eyes of the community on him, dissecting him, judging him, confirming every whispered doubt they'd ever had about Jedediah's second boy. Then came the final, gutting strike. The lawyer paused, a theatrical beat of silence that stretched for an eternity. He peered over his spectacles, his gaze landing on Elias for the first time. The final clause. "To my younger son, Elias," Jedediah's voice seemed to boom from the grave through the lawyer's reedy tone, "I leave the one thing that best reflects his own utility, the old workhorse, shadow." The words hung in the oppressive heat, followed by a moment of stunned silence, and then a sound more brutal than any physical blow: laughter. It started with Caleb, a sharp, barking laugh that tore through the solemn atmosphere. It was picked up by his cronies, a chorus of mockery that rained down on Elias, branding him not just as disinherited, but as a joke. He was worth a single aging animal, a horse deemed too old and spent for the hard labor of the fields. It was a public declaration from his own father that he was useless, a burden, worth less than the dust that settled on the porch railings. The pain was a white-hot poker in his chest, a searing agony that threatened to buckle his knees. He wanted to scream, to rage, to shatter the smug, laughing faces before him, but he did none of these things. Years of being invisible, of swallowing his pain, had forged a discipline of stone within him. His face remained a mask, impassive, unreadable. He had learned long ago that in a world that valued only brute force, the only power he had was the power to deny them his suffering. And maybe you, watching this right now, know a sliver of that feeling. Have you ever been publicly judged, written off by the very people who were supposed to protect you, when the world decided who you were without ever knowing the contents of your heart? If you've ever felt that particular sting of injustice, you know that the silence that follows is the loudest, most defining sound of all. It's in that silence that a person either breaks or they begin to forge a new kind of strength, one that the world cannot see and therefore cannot take. Without a word, without a single glance back at his laughing brother or the pitying faces of his neighbors, Elias turned. He stepped off the porch, his worn boots meeting the dry, packed earth of the yard. Each step was deliberate, a conscious act of leaving behind the only world he had ever known. The laughter followed him, a cruel and persistent ghost, but he refused to let it quicken his pace. He was not fleeing. He was walking away. He was walking towards the stables, towards the one thing in this entire world that was now his. He was walking toward Shadow. The stable was cool and dark, a sanctuary of hay-scented silence away from the venom of the crowd. And there he was, Shadow. The horse was old, his coat a faded dusty brown, his ribs showing faintly beneath the skin. His head was low, and his eyes, when he lifted them to look at Elias, were deep, dark pools of quiet endurance. He was, in every way, a reflection of the young man who now stood before him. Both of them were deemed worthless by the Vances. Both of them were considered past their prime, and both of them possessed a silent dignity that their tormentors could never understand. Elias reached out a hand, not to the horse's muzzle, but to the strong, steady column of his neck, feeling the warmth and life beneath the coarse hair. He didn't need to speak. The horse seemed to understand. He was a fellow outcast, the only living creature on that entire estate to whom Elias had ever shown unabashed kindness, mending his tack, bringing him extra oats, speaking to him in the quiet hours when the rest of the world was asleep. Now this animal was the sole, tangible piece of his fractured past and the only companion for his unknown future. Elias untied the simple rope halter from the post. The frayed fibers felt solid and real in his hand, an anchor in a world that had just dissolved around him. He took the reins. With a soft click of his tongue, he led Shadow out of the stable and into the blinding afternoon sun. He walked past the main house, his gaze fixed forward, down the long, dusty road that led away from the estate. The sounds of the gathering had faded to a distant murmur, the laughter now just an ugly memory. The dust of the road, a fine red powder, kicked up around his boots, coating them, rising in a small cloud with every step. He was walking away from the rich, dark soil of his inheritance and into a world of forgotten, worthless dust. He was becoming a steward of nothing. He had no money in his pocket, no food in his satchel, and no destination in mind. All he had was a horse that was one hard winter away from the grave, and a heart scorched by the fire of his father's final, cruel judgment. But what no one on that porch understood, what his father, in all his calculating cruelty, could never have predicted, was that in giving him nothing, he had accidentally given him everything. He had given him freedom from their expectations, freedom from their judgment, and freedom from a name that had only ever been a weight upon his soul. In the story to come, you will witness how a man left with nothing but dust and a shadow can build an empire from the very scorn they used to bury him. The lone figure of a young man and his old horse grew smaller and smaller, a slow-moving silhouette against the vast, indifferent landscape. The dust settled back onto the manicured lawns of the Vance estate, a place where everything was now in its proper order. But the dust on the long road ahead was stirring, unsettled, waiting. The world saw a boy worth less than a broken-down animal, a ghost walking away from his own life. But the land, the silent, patient earth itself, was about to meet its truest sun. And the reckoning that would one day return to that white-columned house would be a harvest of justice, sown in the deepest soil of suffering. To understand the man who walked away from everything, you must first walk the dusty roads of his past. You have to go back to the beginning, to the quiet corners of a loud world, to see the boy Elias was before the world told him he was nothing. His life was not a grand tragedy that began on the day of his father's will reading. No, it was a quiet one, a slow erosion of spirit that had started almost from his first breath. He was born into a world that measured a man's worth in the breadth of his shoulders and the volume of his voice, and Elias, from the very start, was a creature of silence and observation. He was a whisper in a house of shouts. While his brother Caleb was wrestling with calves in the yard, learning to bend the world to his will, Elias would be watching an ant carry a leaf 10 times its size. His father, Jedediah, would look at Caleb and see a reflection, a successor, a man of action. He would then turn his gaze to Elias and see only a vacancy, a disappointing stillness. "Where is the fire?" he would roar, his voice a physical force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. "Why do you stare at the dirt like a half-wit?" For Jedediah Vance, the earth was an adversary to be broken, tamed, and forced into submission. For Elias, it was a book written in a language no one else in his family cared to read. He saw the intricate patterns of life and death, of struggle and resilience, in the very soil his father sought only to conquer. His only sanctuary in that world of harsh sun and harder men was his mother, a woman named Sarah. She was like a willow in a forest of oaks, bending where they would break. Her strength found not in rigidity, but in a quiet, enduring grace. She was the one who understood his silence. She saw that his gaze wasn't vacant. It was full. She would find him by the creek, not idle, but studying the way the water carved new paths through the clay, and she would sit beside him not with questions, but with a shared, comfortable quiet. She taught him the names of the wild herbs that grew in the shade of the pines, and the calls of the birds that signaled a coming rain. In her, Elias saw a different kind of power, a partnership with the world, not a war against it. But that sanctuary was tragically brief. She was taken by a fever when Elias was just a boy, and with her last breath, the only source of warmth in his world was extinguished. He was left utterly alone, a ghost in his own home, adrift in a sea of masculine cruelty, where his very nature was a sin. Have you ever known a silence like that? The kind that descends when the one person who truly sees you is gone. It's a silence that becomes a part of you, a hollow space inside your chest where their voice used to be. For Elias, his mother's death was the moment the walls of his cage truly solidified. Without her gentle presence to shield him, his father's disappointment and Caleb's contempt became the air he breathed. The house was no longer a home. It was a constant, grinding trial. Every meal was a test of his fortitude, every day in the fields a showcase for his perceived inadequacies. He wasn't strong enough to hoist the heavy cotton bales like Caleb, nor was his spirit hard enough to whip a stubborn mule without a pang of guilt. These were not just failures in his father's eyes. They were moral failings, a deep and shameful stain on the Vance name. So he retreated. He retreated to the one place where he felt a sense of belonging, the land itself. Not the ploughed and brutalized cotton fields, but the forgotten corners of the estate, the rocky hillsides where nothing profitable grew, the marshy lowlands by the river, the dense thickets of woods that Jedediah saw only as land to be cleared. In these places, Elias became a student. He learned that the stubborn weeds his father cursed were actually deep-rooted plants that held the soil together and prevented it from washing away in the rain. He noticed how certain trees thrived in the hard-pan clay, their roots finding purchase where nothing else could. He learned to read the subtle shifts in the color of the soil, understanding which parts were rich with life and which were tired and depleted from years of relentless cotton farming. He was learning the land's secrets, its language of survival. This was his true education, happening in the shadows, far from the disapproving glare of his father. The community around them, the small town of Shiloh, saw the Vances as a dynasty. Jedediah was a pillar of the county, a man whose word was law and whose wealth was as solid and dependable as the ground itself. His farm was a model of productivity, at least on the surface. Neighbors came to him for advice, for loans, for a brand of harsh, unyielding wisdom that they mistook for strength. Caleb fit seamlessly into this picture. He was loud and confident at the general store, charming to the daughters of other landowners, and ruthless in a horse trade. He was the perfect heir, a younger version of the king. And Elias? To the town, he was an oddity, a footnote in the family story, the quiet Vance boy, the one who was always trailing behind, head down as if looking for something he'd lost. The whispers followed him like his own shadow, not cut from the same cloth, they'd say, more his mother's son, and she was always a bit too delicate for this world. He felt their eyes on him, a mixture of pity and suspicion, and it only pushed him further into his solitude. His only true companion in this world was the horse, Shadow. The animal had once been one of Jedediah's prized workhorses, strong and tireless. But years of hard labor had taken their toll. His back was swayed, his gait was slow, and he was eventually relegated to the lightest of duties before being put out to pasture, largely forgotten. But Elias never forgot him. He saw in the old horse a kindred spirit, another being deemed useless once its peak strength was gone. He would sneak out to the pasture with a stolen apple or a handful of oats. He would brush the burrs from the horse's tangled mane and speak to him in low, soothing tones, telling him things he could never say to another soul. The horse would rest his heavy head on Elias's shoulder, his large, dark eyes filled with a placid understanding. This bond, forged in shared neglect, was the deepest connection Elias had. He was tending to the horse's aches and pains, But in doing so, he was also tending to the wounds within himself. Caleb, of course, saw this affection as yet another weakness to be exploited. His cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it was a quiet, insidious thing. He would find the small vegetable patch Elias had secretly cultivated behind the smokehouse, a place where Elias experimented with the strange, resilient plants he'd found, and trample it under his boots, grinding the tender shoots into the dirt with a sneering laugh. He would tighten the cinch on Shadow's saddle until the old horse grunted in pain, just to watch the flash of helpless anger in Elias's eyes. It was a game to him, a constant campaign to prove his own superiority by highlighting his brother's supposed frailty. Each act of cruelty was a message. You are soft, you are worthless, you do not belong here. And with their father's silent approval, the message was hammered home, day after agonizing day. The world of the Vance estate was built on a simple, brutal philosophy: dominate or be dominated. You broke the horse, you broke the land, and if necessary, you broke the men who worked for you. Jedediah's methods were effective in the short term, producing massive yields of cotton year after year. But Elias, from his silent vantage point, saw what his father and brother refused to see. He saw the soil growing paler each season, the rains washing more and more of it away. He saw the increasing need for more fertilizer, a desperate attempt to force life from a dying earth. His secret dream wasn't to run away. It was to heal the land. He envisioned a farm that worked in partnership with nature, not against it, a place of crop rotation, of terraced fields to hold the water, of livestock enriching the soil instead of just taking from it. It was a dream of sustainability, of wisdom, of a strength found in understanding, not in force. But in his father's world, this dream was the ultimate heresy. It was the fantasy of a weakling who didn't have the stomach for the hard work of mastery. And so, every memory, every whispered insult, every trampled plant, and every moment of shared silence with an old horse, all of it coalesced into the single, crushing weight of that afternoon on the porch. The lawyer's words were not the beginning of his pain. They were merely the public confirmation of a verdict that had been handed down long ago. His father's final act was not just to disinherit him, but to validate every fear, every insecurity that had been cultivated in him since childhood. He was being told, in front of the whole world, that his quiet nature, his empathy, his deep connection to the earth, everything that made him who he was worth less than a broken-down animal. The laughter from the crowd was just the final nail in the coffin of his old life. Now, walking down that long, dusty road, each step is a step away from that identity. The dust that cakes his boots is the very same dust of the fields he was never meant to inherit. It rises in a cloud around him and shadow, a shroud for the boy he was and a veil for the man he must become. The pain is a constant physical presence, a fire in his gut, but beneath it, something else is stirring. A tiny, hard kernel of something he hasn't felt in a very long time. It is not hope, not yet. It is something far more primal. It is the grim, unyielding resolve of a thing that has been pushed to the very edge of existence and has refused to die. He is a steward of dust and shadow now, the king of a forgotten kingdom. He has been stripped of his name, his home, and his future. He has nothing left to lose. And perhaps you have felt a shadow of that. A moment when you realized the world's judgment of you was absolute, and that no amount of pleading or proving could change it. It is a terrifying moment, but it is also a moment of profound and terrifying freedom. When you have nothing left to lose, you are finally free to build something new, something that is entirely your own from the ground up. Elias Vance didn't know it yet, as the sun beat down on his back and the silhouette of his former home vanished behind him, but his father had made a fatal miscalculation. He had intended to bury his son under the weight of his scorn. But what happens when you try to bury a seed? What Jedediah Vance, in all his worldly power, never understood was that the harshest, most unforgiving ground is sometimes the very place where the strongest roots take hold. The boy who loved the forgotten corners of the world was now in a forgotten corner of his own. His journey into the crucible had just begun, a trial by hunger, by cold, and by the cruelty of strangers. But what was waiting? For him in the wilderness, in a patch of land even more worthless than he was, would not be the end he expected. It would be the beginning of a reckoning that would one day shake the very foundations of the house he left behind. The first few days on the road were a blur of dust and sun, a monotonous rhythm of walking until his legs ached, and resting until the ache became a different kind of pain. The world had shrunk to the space between his own weary feet and Shadow's slow, plodding hooves. Hunger, which had been a distant threat on the Vance estate, was now an intimate, gnawing presence in the pit of his stomach. He learned its language quickly, the initial hollowness, the sharp cramps that followed, and finally, the dull, listless exhaustion that settled over him like a shroud. He and Shadow drank from creeks, the water tasting of mud and minerals, and foraged for what little they could find, a few bitter wild berries, the tough roots of a plant he vaguely recognized from his mother's lessons. The coins in his pocket, a paltry sum he'd saved over years from odd mending jobs, felt both impossibly heavy and terrifyingly light. Each one was a choice, a single meal or a handful of oats for Shadow, and the decision was a new kind of torture. It was on the fourth day that a sliver of what felt like hope appeared on the horizon, a farm, smaller than the Vance estate but well kept, with fences that needed mending, and a barn whose roof was missing a patch of shingles. The owner, a man named Abernathy with a face as hard and furrowed as his fields, looked Elias and Shadow up and down with a shrewd, calculating gaze. He saw not a boy in need, but a pair of desperate hands and a beast of burden with a few last miles left in him. He offered work, a week of labor from sunup to sundown, mending every broken thing on his property. In exchange, he promised a place in the hayloft, 2 meals a day, and a few dollars at the week's end. To Elias, who had been staring into the abyss of starvation, the offer sounded like salvation. He accepted with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful, his voice cracking with disuse. For 7 days, Elias poured every ounce of his remaining strength into the work. This was a language he understood. He reset fence posts with a steady, practiced hand, his lean frame surprisingly strong. He rethatched the barn roof, his movements careful and precise. He cleared a field of stones, his back screaming in protest, but his spirit, finding a strange solace in the tangible, honest labor. He was good at this. He was good at mending things. For the first time since leaving home, a tiny, fragile sense of worth began to sprout in the barren soil of his soul. He shared his meager meals of cornbread and beans with Shadow, crumbling his portion into the horse's feed bucket, whispering to him that things would get better. He felt the old horse lean against him, a silent acknowledgement of their shared pact of survival. He allowed himself to believe that this was a new beginning, that his father's judgment was not a life sentence, but merely a single cruel chapter. The end of the week arrived with the setting sun, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Elias, exhausted but with a clean conscience, approached Mr. Abernathy on the porch. The farmer was cleaning his nails with a pocket knife, his face unreadable. Elias explained that the work was finished, every last task completed. Abernathy grunted, not even bothering to look up. He reached into his pocket and tossed a few coins onto the porch steps, the sound a dull, insulting clink. It was less than half of what he had promised. When Elias, his voice trembling slightly, reminded him of their agreement, Abernathy finally met his gaze. His eyes were as cold and dead as river stones. He sneered, claiming the work was too slow, that a real man would have finished in half the time. He pointed a calloused finger at Shadow. "And that useless animal of yours ate more than he's worth. Now get off my land before I call you a thief for the food you've already consumed." The injustice was a physical blow, knocking the air from Elias's lungs. It was his father's voice all over again, cloaked in the accent of a stranger. There was nothing to say, no court of appeal for a boy with nothing. He picked up the coins, the metal feeling like ice against his skin, and walked away, the farmer's dismissive laughter following him like a curse. Back on the road, the shame was a heavier burden than the hunger. He had been a fool. He had allowed himself to hope, and the world had swiftly punished him for it. His father's words echoed in his mind, no longer a memory, but a living, breathing tormentor. "You are too soft for this world, boy. You trust too easily. You lack the spine to take what is yours." He looked at Shadow, whose pace seemed even slower now, and the guilt was a fresh, raw wound. He had worked his only friend to the bone for a pittance that would barely buy them a day's worth of food. Was this his destiny, to be used and discarded, a ghost drifting through a world that had no use for menders, only for breakers? The solitude of the road pressed in on him, vast and absolute. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone, a single insignificant speck in an uncaring universe. Have you ever been cheated so completely that it steals more than just your money? when it takes a piece of your faith in the world, leaving you colder and harder than you were before? That feeling, that hardening of the heart, was beginning to take root in Elias. A few nights later, seeking shelter from a biting wind, he saw the flicker of a campfire in a copse of trees. Two men sat around it, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. They looked as rough and road-worn as he felt, and they waved him over with a gesture that seemed friendly enough. They offered to share their fire, and Elias, despite a prickle of unease, was too cold and too desperate for a moment of human company to refuse. He sat at a distance, holding Shadow's rein tightly, nodding silently as they spoke of hard times and bad luck. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey and a quiet, predatory tension that he was too naive to properly identify. The attack was sudden, a blur of motion in the firelight. One man kicked the fire, sending sparks and embers flying into the darkness to blind him, while the other lunged. Elias was thrown to the ground, the impact driving the air from his chest. A knee pressed into his back, and rough hands tore at his pockets, finding the few coins he had left from Abernathy's insult. They were not content with just the money. It was the humiliation they seemed to enjoy. They kicked him in the ribs, the thud of the boot against his body a sickening sound. They called him a scarecrow, a half-starved dog, laughing at his pathetic lack of resistance. Through the haze of pain, Elias's only thought was of Shadow. He watched in terror as one of the men grabbed the horse's reins, but the old animal, sensing the threat, bared his teeth and let out a hoarse, rattling sound that was more threat than whinny. The man, startled, let go, deciding the decrepit horse wasn't worth the trouble. They gave Elias one last kick for good measure, and then melted back into the night, their laughter fading into the chirping of the crickets. He lay there for a long time, the cold ground seeping into his bruised body. Every breath was a sharp, stabbing pain in his side. They had taken everything. The coins, the small bit of jerky he'd been saving, and the last flickering ember of his belief in the decency of others. The world was not merely unjust, it was actively cruel. It was a place where the strong preyed on the weak, and there was no honor, no fairness, only the brutal calculus of power. He pulled himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest, and leaned against Shadow's solid frame. The horse nuzzled his cheek, his warm breath a small comfort in the vast, cold darkness. The physical pain was a fire in his ribs, but the deeper pain was the utter annihilation of his spirit. He had been rendered completely and totally helpless, a victim. He was exactly the man his father had always accused him of being, weak, worthless, and unable to defend himself. The next town he stumbled into bore the cruelly ironic name of Prosperity. It was a small, dusty collection of buildings where every window seemed to hold suspicious eyes. Elias was a walking spectre of poverty and violence, his face bruised, his clothes torn, his body stooped with pain and hunger. He was a blight on their tidy, prosperous world. He tried the general store, hoping to beg for a day's work in exchange for a bag of oats for Shadow. The proprietor took one look at him and waved him away with a broom, as if sweeping away dirt. He approached the sheriff, a man with a large belly and a small heart, and asked if there was any way to find help. The sheriff just pointed down the road. "Keep moving, boy, we don't take kindly to vagrants in this town." Each rejection was another stone laid on his chest, making it harder to breathe. He was an outcast, a pariah, his suffering an inconvenience to be ignored. The doors of the world were closed to him. The sky, as if sensing his despair, began to weep. It started as a cold drizzle, but soon turned into a relentless, driving rain. The temperature plummeted. The dust on the road turned to a thick, clinging mud that sucked at his boots with every step. He had no coat, no shelter, nothing but his own thin shirt to protect him from the elements. The cold was a different kind of enemy, insidious and patient. It found its way through his clothes, into his skin, and began to settle deep within his bones. He looked at Shadow, whose head was bowed low against the deluge, his faded coat plastered to his gaunt frame. A wave of guilt so powerful it almost brought him to his knees washed over Elias. He had failed him. He had led this loyal, trusting animal out into the wilderness only to starve him, to freeze him, to lead him to a miserable, lonely end. His father's final curse, the gift of this horse, now seemed like the most exquisite form of torture imaginable. He was being forced to watch the living symbol of his own worthlessness die a slow, agonizing death because of his own incompetence. He found a shallow overhang of rock by the side of the road, a pathetic mockery of a shelter that did little to stop the wind and the driving rain. He huddled beneath it, his body racked with violent shivers. The world had become a grey, watery blur. The pain in his ribs, the gnawing hunger, the crushing weight of his failure, it all began to merge into a single overwhelming sensation of defeat. He had nothing left. No money, no food, no strength, no hope. His father was right. Caleb was right. The world was right. He was nothing. A mistake. A whisper in a house of shouts that had finally been silenced. He felt a strange, deceptive warmth begin to spread through his limbs as the shivering subsided. He knew what it was. It was the body's final surrender to the cold. It was the beginning of the end. He closed his eyes, a sense of profound, weary relief washing over him. The fight was over. He could finally rest. The darkness beckoned, a quiet, peaceful oblivion. But the darkness was not allowed to take him. A sudden, forceful pressure against his chest jolted him from the edge. He opened his eyes to see Shadow's large head pushing against him, insistent and strong. The horse let out a low, guttural nicker, his warm breath misting in the cold air, washing over Elias's face. It was not a plea, it was a command. Live. The horse pushed him again, harder this time, forcing him to shift, to move, to break the lethal stillness that had claimed him. Elias looked into those deep, dark, patient eyes, and he saw not pity, but a reflection of his own forgotten endurance. This animal, old and spent and discarded, refused to give up. This creature, who had every reason to lie down and die, was demanding that he do the same. In that moment, leaning against the one being in the entire world who had not abandoned him, Elias did not find hope. He found something far more important. He found a single, stubborn, inexplicable reason to take one more breath. He wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, drawing on its warmth, its life, its silent, unyielding strength. The storm, still, raged around them, and the dawn was a lifetime away. He was broken, battered, and at the absolute bottom of existence, but he was not dead yet, and in a world that had tried its very best to erase him, that single fact had become an act of defiance. The dawn that followed the storm was a quiet, fragile thing, born of a sky scrubbed clean and pale. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a world that smelled of wet earth and cold stone. Elias awoke not to the gentle pull of oblivion, but to the sharp, insistent ache of his bruised ribs and the solid warmth of Shadow pressed against his back. The horse had stood over him all night, a living shield against the worst of the wind. Opening his eyes, Elias saw the world transformed. The deluge had washed the dust from the air, and every detail of the landscape stood out in stark, crystalline clarity. He was in a shallow valley, a bowl of land that looked like God's own afterthought. It was a place defined by everything it lacked. The soil was not the rich, dark loam of the Vance estate. It was a pale, reddish clay, cracked and hard. Boulders, like the bones of the earth, jutted from the ground, and the vegetation was a stubborn, wiry collection of weeds and thorny scrub that no sensible farmer would ever bother to clear. It was, by every measure he had ever been taught, worthless land. Yet as the first rays of the rising sun spilled over the ridge, they illuminated something that only Elias could see. He noticed the way the rainwater, instead of just running off, had collected in natural depressions, held there by the very rocks that made the land impossible to plough. He saw that a particular type of tough, deep-rooted grass grew in the shadow of these boulders, its green a defiant splash of life against the barren clay. He watched a trickle of water from a small, hidden spring snake its way down a gully, a thin, silver thread of possibility. His father would have spit on this ground. Caleb would have laughed. But Elias, a man who had been told he was worth less than dust, felt an unfamiliar stirring in his soul. He was looking at a reflection of himself, broken, scarred, and utterly discarded by the world, yet somehow stubbornly holding on to a secret, hidden life. He had been a steward of nothing, but here was a kingdom of forgotten things, a place that spoke his own silent language of survival. He had been studying the lay of the land for the better part of an hour, when a voice, dry and raspy like the rustle of autumn leaves, startled him. "You see the water, don't you, boy?" Elias spun around, his hand instinctively going to Shadow's rein, his body tensing for a fight he knew he couldn't win. An old man stood not 20 feet away, leaning on a gnarled walking stick. He was black, his skin the color of rich earth, his face a roadmap of wrinkles that spoke of a life lived under a hard sun. He was thin, almost as gaunt as Elias, but his eyes were not defeated. They were sharp, clear, and held. A deep, assessing intelligence. The man wasn't looking at Elias with pity or suspicion. His gaze was fixed on the gully, on the same trickle of water that had captured Elias's attention. Most folks, they just see the rocks, the man continued, his voice calm, unthreatening. They see the fight. They don't see how the land is trying to hold on to its drink. Elias said nothing, his throat tight with a distrust that had been beaten into him. The old man seemed to understand. He didn't move closer. He just nodded slowly, as if confirming a thought to himself. My name is Silas. This here is my corner of the world. The county sold it for back taxes years ago. Nobody wanted it then. Nobody wants it now. He gestured with his stick to a small, rough-hewn cabin barely visible in a stand of scrub pines on the far side of the valley. It was little more than a shack, but a thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a sign of life in the desolation. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Elias was in the presence of someone who wasn't trying to take something from him, to judge him, or to cast him out. He was simply being observed by a man who seemed to understand the very ground beneath their feet. Silas's eyes finally shifted from the land to Elias, and then to the old horse standing patiently beside him. That's a good animal, he said simply. Got a lot of heart left in him. You can see it in his eyes. He's a stayer. That simple observation, that acknowledgement of shadows, worth was the key that unlocked the frozen gate around Elias's heart. He found his voice, though it was hoarse and weak. His name is Shadow. The word hung in the air, the first piece of himself he had offered to another human being since he'd walked away from his home. Silas nodded again. A fitting name. He knows about staying in the quiet places. Silas then did something extraordinary. He didn't offer charity, which Elias's raw pride would have rejected. He offered knowledge. He pointed with his stick to the hardy green grass Elias had noticed. That ain't a weed, he said. That's buffalo grass, got roots that go down 10 feet, holds the soil together when the rains come. And see there? He indicated the shallow depressions. The old ones, my grandmother's people, they'd build on that. They'd dig that out just a little, build a low wall of stone on the downhill side, called it a swale, catches every drop of rain that falls, holds it in the earth instead of letting it run off to be wasted. He spoke of building terraces with the very stones that cluttered the fields, of using the scrub brush as a mulch to keep the sun from baking the moisture out of the clay. He was describing a partnership with the land, the very dream Elias had secretly harbored, in the shadow of his father's tyranny. It was as if a door had opened into a world Elias had only ever glimpsed. Everything Silas said resonated with a deep, instinctual truth he had always felt, but never had the words for. He was learning a new gospel, a gospel of resilience, of patience, of coaxing life from the most unforgiving of circumstances. Silas wasn't teaching him how to break the land. He was teaching him how to heal it, and in doing so, he was offering Elias a blueprint to heal himself. He invited Elias back to his cabin, and for the first time in weeks, Elias sat by a warm fire, a bowl of hot stew in his hands. It was a simple meal of beans and wild greens, but it tasted like a feast. He listened as Silas spoke, not of his own hardships, but of the land's memory, of the wisdom that was being forgotten in the world's mad rush for more, for bigger, for faster. He saw in Silas a strength far more profound than his father's blustering power. It was the quiet, unyielding strength of a root, finding its way through solid rock. That night, sleeping on a pallet by the fire in Silas's cabin while Shadow rested in a small, sturdy lean-to outside, Elias made a choice. He could take this small measure of kindness, this brief respite from his suffering, and continue on his path, a ghost drifting toward an unmarked grave. Or he could stay. He could stop running from the judgment of the world, and instead turn and face this piece of it that no one else wanted. He could take the scorn, the neglect, the worthlessness that had been heaped upon him, and plant it in this hard, unforgiving soil, and see what, if anything, would grow. It was a terrifying prospect, a gamble with the last, tattered remnants of his own life. And what about you? If you were pushed to the very edge, stripped of everything, and offered one last impossible chance on a piece of broken ground, would you have the courage to pick up a stone and begin to build? Would you have the faith to believe that something beautiful could grow from the very place of your deepest pain? The next morning, Elias gave his answer, not in words, but in action. He found a loose stone at the base of the gully and rolled it into place. Then, another and another. He began to build his first swale, The work was brutal, a penance and a prayer enacted through the straining of his muscles. His hands, soft from weeks of idleness and hunger, were soon raw and blistered, then calloused and hard. Silas watched him, offering advice, pointing out the subtle contours of the earth, but he let Elias do the work. He understood that this was more than just farming. This was an act of reclamation. Elias was not just moving stones. He was building a foundation for a new life, a life where his worth would be measured not by the name he carried or the inheritance he was denied, but by the sweat of his own brow and the resilience of his own spirit. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Elias and Silas worked side by side, two outcasts forging a world in a forgotten valley. They cleared land, built terraces, and planted a small crop of drought-resistant beans and squash, using seeds Silas had saved for years. Elias felt a change happening, within him a slow, quiet hardening. The fear that had been his constant companion was being replaced by a grim, focused determination. The shame was being burned away by the heat of the sun and the fire in his muscles. Slowly, miraculously, the land began to respond. The swales held the water from the infrequent rains, and the thirsty clay began to soften. The first tender green shoots that pushed their way through the soil were a sight so beautiful it brought an ache to Elias's chest. He would walk the rows in the evening, touching the leaves, his heart filled with a fierce protective love for this small patch of life he had coaxed from the edge of death. Shadow, too, was changing. With a steady supply of fodder from the tough grasses and a share of their meager harvest, the old horse began to fill out. The haunted look in his eyes was replaced by a calm placidity. He was no longer a symbol of Elias's worthlessness, but a testament to their shared endurance. Their small farm was an oasis of their own making, a secret kept by the silent ridges that surrounded them. For the first time, Elias felt something that resembled peace. He had found his purpose not in a grand estate, but in this small, stubborn pocket of the world. He was no longer the son of Jedediah Vance. He was the steward of this dust, this shadow, this life. But the world does not long abide a secret. One late autumn afternoon, as the sun was setting and casting long shadows across his terraced fields, Elias was standing on the small ridge that overlooked his valley. He was looking at his creation, the neat rows of crops, the glint of water in the swales, the sturdy cabin he and Silas had reinforced for the coming winter. It was a testament to the impossible, and it was then that he saw it, a figure on horseback silhouetted against the blood-red sky on the far ridge, the one that led back toward the town of prosperity, back toward the world that had cast him out. The rider was too far away to be identified, a mere speck in the distance, but he was there, motionless, watching. The peace that Elias had so painstakingly cultivated was shattered in an instant, replaced by the cold, familiar grip of dread. His sanctuary had been discovered. The silence was about to be broken. He did not know who the rider was or what he wanted, but he knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut that his trial by fire was not over. The world he had escaped was coming for him, and the harvest he had fought so hard to grow was about to face its most dangerous season yet. The rider on the ridge was not a stranger. As the distance closed over the next hour, the silhouette sharpened into a memory, a ghost from a life Elias had buried under years of stone and soil. It was Caleb. He rode not the fine stallion of his inheritance, but a tired-looking mare, and he was not alone. Two other men, rough-faced and carrying the grim look of hired muscle, flanked him. They stopped at the edge of Elias's valley, their presence a violation, a dark stain on the landscape of his hard-won peace. For years, the world outside this sanctuary had been a distant rumor, a story told by the wind. Now it had returned, and it wore his brother's face. Elias felt Silas come to stand beside him, the old man's presence a silent, solid reassurance. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The war they had both fled had finally followed them home. The drought had been the talk of the region for 2 long seasons. It was a slow, creeping death that had started in the east and spread like a fever, leaving the land cracked and gasping. Elias and Silas had seen it coming. Their entire farm was an answer to a question the rest of the world had forgotten to ask. What do you do when the sky refuses to weep? Their swales were full, their deep mulched soil held its moisture like a sponge, and the hidden spring, the valley's secret heart, still trickled with life. But beyond their ridges, the world was burning. The Vance estate, once the symbol of Jedediah's dominion over the earth, had become its greatest victim. Caleb, who knew only how to take from the land, not how to listen to it, had driven it into ruin. He had planted cotton on top of cotton, bleeding the soil dry, and when the rains failed, he had no answer. His kingdom had turned to dust. Caleb dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry grass at the valley's edge. He had aged, but not with grace. The arrogant confidence of his youth had curdled into a bitter, resentful fury. His eyes, when they met Elias's across the short distance, were not the eyes of a brother seeking aid. They were the eyes of a king surveying a rebellion. He didn't see a miracle of resilience. He saw an affront, a personal insult. How dare this worthless ground thrive while his own birthright withered? How dare the weakling, the outcast, possess the one thing he now needed more than anything, water? He had not come to beg, he had come to take back what he believed was rightfully his. This water, Caleb's voice was a harsh rasp, a sound of rust and gravel. It flows from Vance land. It belongs to me. He gestured to the spring, the source of the clear, life-giving stream that fed Elias's entire system. His hired men shifted, their hands resting on the handles of the shovels and pickaxes slung over their shoulders. The intent was brutally clear. They were here to divert the stream, to redirect its flow back towards the dying Vance estate, and in doing so, to kill this valley and everything in it. It was the final ultimate act of his lifelong campaign against his brother, to find the one thing Elias had built, the one source of his strength, and to break it. A small crowd of neighboring farmers had begun to gather on the ridge behind Caleb. They were drawn by the confrontation, their faces gaunt with the worry of the drought. They had heard the whispers of the miracle in the barren valley, the story of the outcast Vance boy who was making water from stone. They had come to see for themselves, and now they were witnesses to a final desperate reckoning. They watched in silence, their sympathies unreadable. In this hard land, water was life, and the right to it was a matter of survival. They were here to see whose claim, whose strength would prevail. Elias looked at his brother, at the familiar sneer of contempt, and he felt not fear, but a profound and weary sadness. He saw a man so trapped in the prison of his own pride that he would rather destroy his brother than admit his own failure. He had spent years preparing for this moment, not with weapons, but with wisdom. He had learned from Silas that the greatest strength was not in resisting the storm, but in building a shelter so strong the storm could not touch what mattered most. He had not just built a farm, he had built a fortress of resilience. This water belongs to the land, Caleb. Elias's voice was quiet, yet it carried across the still air with an undeniable authority. You and I are just passing through. Caleb let out a short, barking laugh, the same sound of mockery from that long-ago afternoon on the porch. The land, he sneered. The land doesn't have a voice. Men have voices, and my voice says, this water is mine. He gave a sharp nod to his men. They advanced, their heavy boots trampling the carefully tended grasses at the edge of the stream. They raised their tools, the metal glinting in the harsh sunlight, ready to tear into the earth, to rip open the artery of Elias's world. And you watching this, have you ever faced a moment like this? A moment where everything you have painstakingly built is about to be destroyed by the brute force of someone else's envy, when their need to see you fail is greater than their own need to survive. It is the ultimate test. Do you meet their violence with violence? Do you become the very thing you have fought so hard not to be? Or is there another way? Is there a strength that looks like surrender, but is in fact the most profound kind of victory? Elias held up a hand, not a gesture of surrender, but of command. Wait. The hired men paused, looking to Caleb for direction. Caleb's eyes narrowed, sensing a trick. Don't beg, Elias. It was always your worst quality. Elias ignored him. He looked past Caleb to the watching farmers on the ridge. He looked at Silas, who gave him a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Then he looked back at his brother. You are right about one thing, Caleb. This spring does rise on land that once bore our family's name. By your laws you have a claim, so take it. The words hung in the air, stunning everyone into silence. The hired men looked confused. Caleb's face was a mask of suspicion. What game was this? Elias walked to the head of the stream near the rocks where the spring bubbled up from the earth. He knelt down. Beside the main channel, hidden beneath a covering of flat stones and turf, was a large iron lever set into a wooden frame. It was a sluice gate, a mechanism he and Silas had built years ago, a piece of engineering that was as invisible to a casual observer as the deep roots of the buffalo grass. With a grunt of effort, he pulled the heavy lever. The mechanism groaned, and a section of the stream bank, reinforced with timber, slid open. The flow of water from the spring faltered, then stopped. The stream that ran through the valley began to shrink, the water level dropping rapidly, leaving behind a trail of dark, wet earth. A collective gasp went through the crowd on the ridge. Caleb's face broke into a triumphant, cruel grin. He thought his brother had just surrendered, had just committed an act of agricultural suicide out of fear. "He's a coward, just like Father always said," Caleb shouted to the crowd, his voice full of gloating victory. "He's given up." His men laughed, lowering their tools, believing the fight was over. They turned to look upstream, expecting to see the water now flowing in a new channel. They would dig towards the Vance land, but there was nothing. The water was gone. It had not been diverted. It had simply vanished. A confused murmur spread through the onlookers. Caleb's smile faltered. "Where did it go?" he demanded, his voice suddenly tight with confusion and rage. Elias rose to his feet, his face calm. He pointed not to the dry stream bed, but to the ground itself, to the series of terraced fields that climbed the gentle slope of the valley. "You only ever saw what was on the surface, Caleb. You saw the stream, the plants, the things that were easy to see, but the real work, the important work, happens in the dark. It happens underground. For years, you see, Silas and I weren't just building swales. We were building a second reservoir." He stomped his foot on the ground, and the sound was not the solid thud of earth, but a faint, hollow echo. "We found a natural basin in the rock beneath this field. We lined it with clay, sealed it, and for 5 years, we have been slowly filling it with the overflow from the spring. A cistern, hidden from the sun, protected from the drought. A secret heart, full of water, waiting. The sluice gate didn't stop the spring, Caleb. It just sent it home." The revelation settled over the crowd with the force of a physical blow. The quiet Vance boy, the weakling, the fool who had been given a worthless horse, had outthought them all. He had not prepared for a good season. He had prepared for the end of the world. He had built, not just for prosperity, but for survival. Caleb stood frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief turning to humiliation. He had come here with shovels and threats, a plan of brutish simplicity, only to be defeated by an act of quiet, patient, brilliant foresight. He had been so focused on the visible stream that he had never once considered the possibility of a hidden river. He had played a child's game of checkers, and Elias had been playing chess. The laughter started then. It was not the loud, cruel laughter that had rained down on Elias years ago. It was a low, rumbling chuckle that began with one of the farmers on the ridge, a sound of pure, unadulterated awe. It spread through the crowd, growing not in cruelty, but in respect. They were laughing at Caleb's arrogance, at his spectacular public failure. They were laughing at the sheer, beautiful irony of it all. The hired men, sensing the shift in power, the utter foolishness of their employer, began to back away, quietly laying down their tools. They were not being paid enough to be on the losing side of a legend. Caleb's face, which had been pale with shock, now flushed with a deep, mottled red of pure rage. He lunged at Elias, his hands reaching for his brother's throat, his mind reverting to the only form of power he had ever understood, brute force. But he never reached him. Silas, old and wiry, but with a strength forged from a lifetime of labor, stepped between them. He didn't raise a weapon. He just held up his walking stick, blocking Caleb's path. The gesture was enough. It was a wall of quiet dignity that Caleb could not breach. "Enough," the old man said, his voice soft, but carrying the weight of finality. "The boys' war is over. It is time for you to go home." Defeated, shamed, and utterly alone, Caleb stumbled backward. The laughter of the crowd was a physical torment, each chuckle a stone cast against his shattered pride. He looked at Elias, at the man who had been a ghost in his own family, and for the first time he saw not a weakling, but a power he could not comprehend and could never defeat. Without another word, he turned and scrambled back to his horse, hauling himself into the saddle. He rode away, not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive, the sound of his own public humiliation chasing him down the long, dusty road. The curse he had helped to cast had finally come home to roost. The news of Caleb's defeat spread through the county faster than a brush fire. The story of the hidden reservoir of the Quiet brothers' brilliant victory became a local legend overnight. The bank, which had been extending credit to the Vance name out of respect for Jedediah's memory, saw the truth for what it was. The Vance estate was a hollow shell. its land dead, its owner a fool. The foreclosure notices went up within the week. The final public dismantling of Jedediah Vance's kingdom was scheduled, an auction to be held on the steps of the main house. On the day of the auction, the whole county seemed to be there. It was the same crowd, the same faces that had gathered for Jedediah's will reading all those years ago. But the atmosphere was entirely different. There was no pity in the air, only a tense, expectant curiosity. They watched as the auctioneer began to sell off the farm equipment, the livestock, the household goods, the bones of a once great dynasty, picked clean by failure. Caleb was nowhere to be seen. He had become a ghost in his own right, a spectre of shame who had reportedly left the county in the dead of night. Finally, the auctioneer turned to the main prize, the land itself, the house, the barns, the hundreds of acres of pale, exhausted soil. He called for an opening bid. A silence fell over the crowd. Who would want this broken-down place, this land that had been so thoroughly abused? Then, a voice, calm and clear, cut through the silence. It was Elias. He stood at the back of the crowd, Silas at his side. He was dressed not in fine clothes, but in the simple, clean work clothes of a farmer. But he stood with a quiet confidence that made him the center of all attention. He made his bid. A few other landowners, perhaps sensing a bargain, made counter-offers, but they were half-hearted. Elias met each one with a steady, unwavering response, his bids climbing higher, backed by the profits of several good harvests from his own valley. He was not bidding with inherited money. He was bidding with the wealth he had coaxed from the earth with his own two hands. It was a currency no one else there could match. The final hammer fell. The auctioneer, a man who had known Jedediah for 30 years, looked out at the crowd, a stunned expression on his face. "Sold," he announced, his voice cracking slightly, to Mr. Elias Vance. A wave of murmurs, of shocked whispers and grudging admiration swept through the crowd. Elias did not smile. He simply nodded to the auctioneer and began to walk forward. The crowd parted for him, a silent, human sea, creating a path to the steps of the house. He walked up the very steps from which he had been cast out, his worn boots making a solid, rhythmic sound on the wooden planks. He stood on the porch in the exact spot where he had been publicly branded as worthless and looked out at the faces watching him. He was not a conqueror. His face held no trace of triumph, no hint of revenge. There was only a deep, quiet sense of purpose. He turned his gaze from the people to the land. His land, it was. Wounded, tired and scarred by years of his father's and brother's arrogance, he saw not a prize to be owned, but a patient to be healed. He had learned in his valley of stone that no land is truly worthless, that life can be coaxed back from the very edge of death with patience, with wisdom and with respect. His father had left him a legacy of scorn. He would leave this land a legacy of healing. He had not come back to claim a kingdom, but to mend a broken home. In the years that followed, Elias did just that. He brought the lessons of his valley to the vast acres of the Vance estate. With Silas as his partner and foreman, a man finally given the respect and authority he had been denied his entire life, they began the slow, arduous work of restoration. They dug swales, planted cover crops to replenish the soil, and let fields lie fallow to rest. They planted groves of trees to break the wind and hold the water. Slowly, miraculously, the land began to breathe again. The pale dust softened into rich, dark soil. The green returned. He never married, never had children of his own. The land was his legacy. The community, once so quick to judge him, now came to him for advice. He taught them the methods he had learned from Silas, the wisdom of working with the earth instead of against it. He gave away his knowledge freely, understanding that the health of his own farm was tied to the health of the entire valley. He became not a king, like his father, but a guardian, a true steward. One evening, many years later, Elias was walking through the old stables. He ran a hand over the worn wood of an empty stall, the one where Shadow had spent his final, peaceful years before being laid to rest under a mighty oak overlooking the valley. In the corner of the stall, half buried in the old straw, he saw something. It was a small, crudely carved wooden horse, no bigger than his hand. He picked it up, the wood smooth with age. He remembered carving it as a boy, a secret gift, for his mother that he had hidden away after she died, afraid of his father's scorn. He had forgotten it was even there. Holding the small horse in his calloused palm, the entirety of his life seemed to coalesce into a single, profound truth. He had been born into a world that tried to tell him who he was, that tried to define his worth by its own brutal, narrow standards. He had been cast out, beaten down, and left for dead. But the world's judgment is not a final verdict. It is merely a starting point. True worth is not something that is given to you in a will or bestowed upon you by the opinions of others. It is something you build, day by day, stone by stone, in the silent, forgotten corners of your own heart. It is forged in the fire of your deepest suffering and harvested in the quiet triumph of your own resilience. How many of us have been placed in a cage not of our own making, a cage of expectations, of judgment, of the quiet, crushing belief that we are not enough. We are told we are too quiet, too soft, too different. We are handed an inheritance of scorn and told to be grateful. But the story of Elias Vance is a testament to a universal truth. The ground that is meant to be your grave can, with courage and patience, become your garden. There is always a turning point, a moment when you stop accepting the world's definition of you and begin to write your own. A moment when you realize that the steward of dust and shadow is, in fact, the heir to a kingdom far greater than any land or title. If this story has spoken to a piece of your own journey, if you have ever felt discarded only to find a hidden strength, share a piece of that feeling with us. Let the world know that resilience is real. Write in the comments. I have also known a turning point, because every story of quiet survival that is shared becomes a beacon of hope for someone else still walking in the dark, leading them toward the dawn.